Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Our whole mission here, really, is to give you those clear, thorough, and sometimes surprising insights into the stories shaping our world. We try to cut through all the noise, get to what's actually going on. And today, well, we're plunging into something that honestly sounds like it's been pulled from, the script of a horror movie. Just picture this for a second. You step out into your backyard, maybe with your morning coffee, right? And you spot a rabbit, but something's really wrong. It's covered in these weird horn-like growths sticking out from its body. It looks almost alien. Or maybe it's a squirrel. Usually they're darting around full of energy. But this one, it's got bald patches, sores that are kind of oozing, and open lesions, especially on its face and head. That's unsettling. Genuinely disturbing, actually. It makes you think of, something monstrous. And these images, they aren't just made up. They've been popping up all over social media, local news. It's quite striking. First, it seemed to be mainly rabbits, showing up with those really strange, almost devilish-looking growths. But now, the same kind of bizarre appearance is being seen on squirrels. And that's really sparked some alarm, understandably. So people are left wondering, are we seeing some kind of zombie animal outbreak? We've definitely seen more of these sightings recently. Public awareness really seemed to spike maybe around 2025 in places like Maine, parts of Canada too, I believe. Even though if you dig a bit, you find reports going back to at least 2023, maybe even earlier, just not getting the same attention. It's just visually so arresting, naturally concerning. It kind of demands our attention. Okay, so let's unpack this a bit. Today, we're taking a deep dive into this curious and frankly pretty alarming case of what some people are actually calling zombie squirrels. Mm-hmm. What is really behind these appearances? Is there a genuine danger here to us, to our families, our pets? Are we looking at some kind of, wildlife apocalypse starting? Or is there maybe a more grounded scientific explanation that can help us make sense of it all, maybe calm things down a bit despite how bad it looks?
Yeah, and it's completely natural to feel that jolt of fear, or at least, intense curiosity when you see something so visually jarring right there in your own neighborhood. Your mind just races, doesn't it? Straight to the worst case scenario, often fed by, horror movies and stories about outbreaks. So our mission today is really to cut through that initial shock, get past the scary headlines, and actually explore the science behind it. We'll carefully uncover the specific pathogen responsible here, figure out exactly how it's spreading among these animals, and most importantly, what it all means for you, for your pets, your dogs, your cats, and for the wider environment, our local wildlife. And this brings up a really important question, I think, that goes beyond just the immediate fear. How do we, as informed people, tell the difference between something that's a genuine, serious threat, something needing immediate action, and something that just looks really disturbing but maybe isn't as dangerous as it appears? That's what we're here for, to give you the facts, the solid information, so you can make that distinction. To arm you with knowledge that goes beyond that initial visual horror allows for a clear, rational understanding of what's actually happening.
Okay, let's dive right into that, because the thing you just can't ignore is how these animals look. It's what grabs you, what causes that, knot in your stomach. Like we said, these zombie squirrels, they're being seen with really obvious bald spots, and often these pretty disturbing, scabby sores covering parts of their body. And then, maybe most upsetting, are the open lesions on their faces, their heads. It's visually just, wow, very concerning. Makes you immediately think something truly awful is happening out there in nature. You almost want to look away, but you can't, right? You're kind of morbidly fascinated by how bizarre it is.
Absolutely. The descriptions people are sharing, the photos, the videos online, and in local news, they definitely confirm just how unsettling these growths are. When you see an animal with its face severely disfigured like that, it really does, as you said, look like something from a horror movie. And these fibromas, that's the technical term for these tumorous growths we're talking about, they can sometimes get quite large. We're not talking tiny little spots here. They can swell up, like marbles or even golf balls sometimes, really distorting the animal's face, sometimes even blocking their vision.
Oh.
Yeah, imagine trying to get around, find food, escape predators. If you can't see properly because of these growths, it would cause, profound discomfort, disorientation for a poor squirrel or rabbit. So it's definitely not just a cosmetic thing. It directly impacts their ability to forage, to climb, and crucially, to spot danger. It's painful for us to look at, and it makes total sense that people are deeply alarmed when they see this in their own yard or local park.
So we've got this really vivid, quite disturbing picture. But what exactly is causing it? What's behind these growths that have earned them this really dramatic, scary zombie nickname? Is it something new? Something spreading fast? And the big question, could it jump to us?
Right. And this is where we get to, I think, the first major aha moment. And it's a really crucial bit of scientific clarity. What we're seeing is caused by a virus. Specifically, it's from a family called Leporipox viruses. The Lepori part, Lepori, it actually means rabbit, which is kind of a clue, right? It tells you this family of viruses often affects rabbits and hares.
Ah, okay.
Yeah. And in the specific case of these squirrels, the ones we're mainly talking about in North America, the strain is known as the squirrel fibroma virus, or sometimes you'll hear it called squirrel fibromatosis. And just to quickly explain fibroma for you, it basically just means a benign tumor. It's made of fibrous connective tissue. Think of it like a non-cancerous lump growing on the skin. And this is a really important distinction, often missed when people get alarmed. These growths on the squirrels, they are not cancerous, they're not malignant.
Okay, that's huge.
It is. They won't spread aggressively through the body like cancer does. They're essentially benign skin growths. Think of them maybe like a really, really severe wart or a persistent skin tag, just, well, incredibly unsightly and sometimes, yes, oozing pus. So this isn't some kind of wildlife cancer epidemic. It's more like a really nasty, persistent skin condition that, for most squirrels anyway, eventually just clears up on its own. And about the timing, yeah, the cases that got a lot of recent attention, say in 2025, were in places like Maine and Canada. But if you look back, there are records of squirrel fibroma cases popping up, isolated incidents as far back as 2023, and actually even decades before that. They just didn't hit the public consciousness in the same way until recently.
Okay, this is where it gets really interesting for me, and I think probably quite reassuring for a lot of people listening. Despite how truly awful these fibromas look, what is the actual immediate threat level to us, to humans, or, to our pets?
Yeah.
Because that's always the first question, isn't it? When you see something like this in an animal.
Yes, absolutely. And this is probably the single most significant and hopefully reassuring piece of information we can share today. It's absolutely essential to understand this. The squirrel fibroma virus, the specific Leporipox virus we're seeing in squirrels. It is not contagious between squirrels and humans. These tumors, despite their appearance, are surprisingly harmless to you. We really want to stress that point directly, hopefully ease some anxiety. You simply cannot catch squirrel fibroma virus from an infected squirrel.
Okay.
The virus is what we call highly host-specific. That means it's evolved to only really thrive and replicate properly within its specific host animals, in this case, certain types of squirrels, rabbits, and hares. Humans, well, we just don't have the right cellular machinery, the specific receptors the virus needs to get inside our cells and cause an infection. And what about pets? Your dogs, your cats? Also, no risk there. The virus cannot spread to them either. Really? So there's absolutely no need to panic if your dog gets curious and sniffs around an infected squirrel. Or even if your cat, how cats are, actually catches one. Their biology just isn't compatible with this virus. They're effectively immune to infection from this particular strain. It's a natural barrier, this host specificity, that stops it jumping to us or our common pets. Now, okay, let's talk about the squirrels themselves, because obviously it does affect them. While the growths are undeniably unsightly, and yeah, they can sometimes lead to pretty disturbing amounts of pus-filled lesions, this North American Leporipox virus, the squirrel fibroma virus, it's typically mild in how it runs its course. It usually causes more discomfort, more visual distress, than lasting damage. That's a key distinction. In fact, most squirrels, they make a full recovery from the virus. The lesions usually show up for about, say, 4 to 6 weeks, and then often they start to shrink over time. Eventually they disappear, leaving no significant long-term trauma for the animal. Now, it is important to mention, in very rare, very severe cases, the virus can be indirectly fatal. Yeah, but only indirectly. Like, if the fibromas get so huge, so debilitating that they physically stop the squirrel from seeing properly, or eating, or moving quickly enough to escape predators, that can lead to secondary problems like starvation, dehydration, or just getting picked off easily. But generally speaking, for the vast majority of squirrels that get this, the prognosis is actually pretty good. They tend to bounce back.
So if I'm getting this right, putting it simply, for our North American squirrels, it's less zombie plague, more like a really, really unpleasant case of, say, chickenpox, or maybe a very aggressive but usually temporary skin infection that they typically recover from. That seems like a massive difference, and I bet a lot of listeners will find that incredibly reassuring.
That's a great analogy. Yes, chickenpox, or maybe even something like shingles in humans, unpleasant, looks bad, but usually temporary, it really helps highlight that crucial difference. You could absolutely think of it as a significant but usually transient skin issue for them. The animal gets sick, feels lousy for a bit, looks awful, but then it recovers, much like we might recover from a bad bout of something. And making that clear is so important, especially because, as you alluded to, this particular virus often gets confused with some of its nastier relatives. And that confusion can lead to unnecessary panic and misunderstanding, which actually brings up another really critical point of clarification. Because this North American Leporipox virus, the one causing the squirrel fibroma we see here, it often gets mixed up with another quite different and frankly more dangerous strain that you find across the Atlantic in the UK. We're talking about the UK parapox virus. It's also commonly called squirrel pox. Now, this is a super important distinction to make because even though both viruses cause symptoms that can look similar on the outside, these lesions, these growths, and they both affect squirrels, their outcomes are dramatically different.
Okay, how so?
Well, the UK version, the parapox virus, it specifically affects red squirrels, which is a different species from the common gray squirrels and fox squirrels we have here in North America.
Right.
And unfortunately for those red squirrels, this UK squirrel pox can be profoundly fatal. It causes these widespread, really severe lesions that often lead to death, usually from secondary infections setting in or starvation because they can't feed, or sometimes even organ failure. It's really devastating for the red squirrel populations there. But in stark contrast, the North American Leporipox virus, that's the one infecting our gray and fox squirrels, mostly seen in the Northeast. As we've been saying, it's generally not harmful to the animals in that same severe, fatal way that its British cousin is. So when you hear news reports or see discussions online about squirrel pox or zombie squirrels, it's absolutely vital to know which specific virus they're talking about, which species of squirrel, and which part of the world. Using the term squirrel pox loosely can be really misleading if you don't understand these key biological and geographical differences. Understanding this helped us move past the sort of sensationalism and get to a more accurate scientific picture.
That's a really, really vital clarification because that UK version sounds much, much more serious. Paints a very different picture indeed. So, okay, if humans can't catch this North American squirrel fibroma, and it's mostly mild for the squirrels themselves anyway, how does a virus like this manage to spread so effectively through their populations? Enough to cause this noticeable uptick in sightings we've been talking about. It certainly feels like it's spreading pretty aggressively among them.
That's an excellent question. It really gets to the mechanics of how these sort of localized outbreaks happen. The Leporipox virus, it can be transmitted pretty easily within the same species. When we talk about direct transmission, we mostly mean through the exchange of saliva or other bodily fluids. Remember the fibromas we talked about? They can be open, sometimes oozing with pus or other fluids that are just loaded with viral particles. So any kind of close physical contact between squirrels then becomes a potential way to pass it on. And just think about how squirrels normally behave, right? They're incredibly active, often quite social, especially where there's a good food source. They interact constantly. So squirrels can easily spread the virus to other squirrels just in passing, chasing each other up a tree, foraging near each other on the ground. But the risk goes way up at those communal spots like bird feeders. You often see multiple squirrels there, sometimes almost climbing over each other.
Yeah, definitely see that.
Exactly. And mating obviously involves very close contact, so that's another high-risk time. And then any kind of fight, maybe over territory or food or just defending themselves where there might be a bite or a scratch, that can directly transfer infected fluids too. It's these frequent close interactions that really explain the rapid spread we sometimes see within a local squirrel population. It certainly seems to be a factor in the uptick in cases observed, for instance, in parts of the Northeast around summer 2025. And just to reiterate the hosts, this particular version primarily infects our common gray squirrels and fox squirrels here in North America, as well as rabbits and hares. And again, crucially for pet owners listening, it cannot be spread to other animals like cats or dogs. So truly no risk to your household pets if they happen to encounter an infected squirrel.
That is definitely reassuring for pet owners. So if I'm hearing you right, the very things that make squirrels, their social nature, gathering at feeders, maybe nesting close together, that almost acts like an accelerator for the virus. Kind of like a wildlife version of a crowded bus station, maybe. We're just bumping into someone can pass something along.
Exactly. That's a perfect way to put it. Those high traffic areas, whether it's a popular bird feeder or maybe a particularly good nut tree, they become hot spots for transmission. But what's really fascinating here, and maybe a bit more insidious, is that direct contact isn't the only way this virus gets around. Is that right?
There's another major player involved, especially when we think about how it might move between different species like squirrels and rabbits.
That's absolutely right. And this is another really crucial piece of the puzzle. Like many viruses affecting wildlife, Laportapox virus can also be spread by insects. These insects act as what we call vectors. And just to quickly define that, think of them like little biological mail carriers. They're not getting sick themselves, but they pick up the virus from an infected animal and physically carry it to another one.
Ah, okay. Like what kind of insects?
The main culprits here are common blood-feeding insects. So think mosquitoes and fleas. Now, there's an important nuance here. These insects, they can't host the virus. What that means is the virus doesn't multiply or replicate inside the mosquito or the flea, which is different from diseases like malaria or West Nile virus, where the virus actually grows inside the insect vector.
I see.
Instead, they act more like, well, like contaminated needles maybe, or like a dirty sponge. Let me paint a picture. Imagine a mosquito lands on an infected squirrel, maybe one with those oozing lesions we talked about. It feeds, and in doing so, it picks up virus particles on its mouth parts, that little needle-like thing called a proboscis, gets contaminated. Then, that same mosquito flies off. If it then lands on and feeds on another squirrel, or maybe a rabbit, it can infect that second animal simply by introducing those contaminated mouth parts into their skin, into their bloodstream. The virus isn't growing in the mosquito, it's just being physically carried, mechanically transported from one animal to the next. And this indirect transmission, it's actually remarkably efficient for the virus to move through a population, even between animals that might not actually touch each other directly. Mosquitoes, especially, are very common carriers of this virus, and this is also how rabbits and hares often get infected with various strains of Laportapox virus in their own populations, too.
Wow. Okay, that raises a really important question, doesn't it? It highlights how complex these things are. If insects can carry different strains of these lepropox viruses, and we've already talked about that critical difference between the North American squirrel virus and the UK one, are all these viruses that cause these, zombie-like appearances, are they all equally mild? Or is there a more dangerous relative out there we really should know about, even if it doesn't hit squirrels the same way?
That is a profoundly critical point to dig into. Because, yes, while the squirrel fibroma virus here in North America is generally mild, usually self-limiting, not all lepropox viruses are created equal. Not by a long shot. Let's talk about a related virus, one that's much, much more devastating, and it primarily impacts rabbits and hares. It's called myxomatosis.
Myxomatosis.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Now, the specific virus causing it is the myxoma virus, but it's also in that same big pox virus family. And the symptoms that causes the appearance of these really unsettling tumorous growths and lesions, they look quite similar, actually, to what we see with squirrel fibroma. Visually, they can both create that same frightening zombie-like look. Makes it really hard for someone just looking, a casual observer, to tell them apart without knowing the specifics. However, and this is where the stark difference in severity comes in myxomatosis, can be absolutely fatal for rabbits and hares. Yes, unlike the usually mild outcome for squirrels with fibroma, myxomatosis is often deadly. Now, there are different strains, and they vary a bit in how severe they are, but the version of myxomatosis found in North America, it's actually considered one of the most virulent, one of the most fatal for the species it infects. The prognosis for these animals is often, grim. It's usually a prolonged and quite agonizing decline. Rabbits that get myxomatosis, they develop this severe swelling, particularly around their eyes, their nose, mouth, and also the genitals. They get a fever, become very lethargic, lose their appetite completely, and these swellings, they just get progressively worse. They become obstructive, leading to blindness, making it hard to breathe, impossible to eat. The fatality rates for infected rabbits and hares are incredibly high, often approaching 100%. It effectively makes the virus lethal for almost every rabbit or hare that contracts it.
Wow, 100%. That's devastating.
It really is. And historically, just to give you some context on how potent it is, myxomatosis was actually deliberately introduced in places like Australia and parts of Europe too, back in the mid-20th century. It was used as a biological control agent to try and manage these huge, out-of-control rabbit populations that were just destroying farmland. The sheer effectiveness of the virus in those situations really underscores its lethal potential for rabbits. So the bottom line here is, while we can be largely reassured about the North American squirrel fibroma virus, it's typically mild in squirrels and, crucially, no threat to us or our pets. It is absolutely vital to understand that other closely related viruses, even if they cause similar zombie-like appearances, can have a truly devastating, often fatal impact on other wildlife. It just highlights again how important precise identification is. We need to know the specific pathogen, the specific host when we talk about these things, rather than just lumping everything under one scary generic zombie animal label.
Wow, okay. That really puts things into incredibly sharp focus. It's definitely not a one-size-fits-all situation with these viruses, even if they look disturbingly similar on the surface. That difference between a mild temporary thing for a squirrel and a nearly 100% fatal disease for a rabbit is, well, it's profound. So bringing it back to us, the listeners, what does this all mean practically? We know now we can't catch the squirrel fibroma virus directly. Our pets are generally safe from it. But what should we actually do if we see an infected animal, say in our backyard, or maybe out on a walk in the park?
Right, that's the critical what now part, the practical application. And you're right, while it's true, you as a human cannot catch lepropox which is, as you said, a huge relief, there are still really important precautions we should take. But these precautions, they aren't about protecting yourself from getting sick, they're about preventing the unintended spread of the virus among the wildlife populations. That's a key point. Our actions, even if we mean well, can have significant knock-on effects for these animals and their health. It really comes down to being a responsible steward, of the natural world right around us.
Okay, so what does that look like in practice?
Well, the single most important piece of advice when it comes to responsible wildlife interaction is pretty straightforward. Keep a respectful distance.
Yeah.
And definitely avoid touching squirrels or really any wild animal for that matter. And this applies whether they look sick or perfectly healthy. It might be your immediate human instinct, right? To want to help an animal that looks like it's suffering, especially one with those really obvious, maybe pus-filled lesions. You feel compassion.
Sure, of course.
But acting on that instinct, going up to it, trying to handle it, that would actually only increase the risk of spreading the virus further to other animals. Remember, although we can't get infected, we could still become like mechanical carriers. Imagine you touch one of those oozing sores, maybe trying to help the squirrel. Then, without realizing it, you transfer that fluid, those viral particles, onto another surface, maybe a tree branch nearby, or the bird feeder, or even just the ground. Another squirrel could then come along and pick it up from there.
Ah, I see. So you become an accidental go-between.
Exactly. Your well-meaning attempt to help could inadvertently make you an unintended vector, helping the disease spread. So the absolute best thing to do, always just observe from a safe, respectful distance. Let nature take its course. Now, if an animal seems to be in really immediate distress or danger, like maybe it's stuck somewhere or clearly injured in a way unrelated to the virus itself, then the right thing to do is contact your local wildlife authorities or a licensed wildlife rehabilitator. They know how to handle these situations safely and appropriately. But for the virus itself, distance is key.
That makes perfect sense. That human desire to help could, kind of paradoxically, end up doing more harm by spreading the virus within that squirrel community. Really shows that delicate balance, doesn't it? So, okay, if we zoom out a bit then, connect this to the bigger picture. What can we do proactively in our own yards, our neighborhoods, to maybe help limit the spread of this virus among the wildlife, especially the squirrels, now that we know how it gets around? It sounds like it's not just about not touching them, right?
Exactly right. It definitely goes beyond just individual interactions. There are absolutely proactive things, community level type measures that individuals can take right in their own space that can make a real difference. And one really significant area to think about is those communal feeding spots we mentioned specifically, bird feeders.
Oh, okay. The bird feeders again.
Yep. Experts strongly advise people to consider not leaving out bird feeders, at least temporarily, if you know there are infected squirrels hanging around your area. Now, this isn't about the birds, they aren't susceptible to this particular virus. It's entirely about the squirrels congregating there. You see, bird feeders, even though people put them out with good intentions, wanting to help wildlife, they can accidentally become these super spreader sites for lepropox virus among squirrels.
Because they all crowd together.
Precisely. The reason is simple. You get multiple squirrels gathering, feeding from the exact same spot. Especially if other food is scarce. They crowd each other, they jostle for position, they have physical interactions. And in those close quarters, the virus can just spread like wildfire through that local community. It can happen directly, through contact with saliva or pus from lesions, or even indirectly if an infected squirrel leaves contaminated fluids on the feeder surface itself and another squirrel picks it up later. So, if you do notice an infected squirrel around, Maybe consider taking your feeders down for a few weeks. It can really help break that chain of transmission. It removes that major gathering point and just limits the opportunities for the virus to spread so easily through close contact.
What about cleaning them? Does that help?
Cleaning is definitely important if you choose to keep feeders out. Regular, very thorough cleaning with something like a dilute bleach solution, maybe 1 part bleach to 9 parts water, can help disinfect the surfaces. But honestly, temporary removal is often the most effective step if you're seeing sick animals. Okay, so that's feeders. What else? Well, another really crucial proactive measure, especially thinking about that indirect transmission route we talked about, that involves eliminating standing water that attracts mosquitoes.
Right, the vector.
Exactly. Since we know lepropox virus can also be transmitted by insects like mosquitoes, those little mail carriers, taking steps to avoid attracting them to your property is really key. This means just being vigilant about your yard, your surroundings, regularly empty out bird baths. Make sure your gutters are clean, not clogged up holding water. Check around for puddles after it rains and get rid of them. Dump out water that collects in old tires, buckets, plant pot saucers, anything that can hold water. It doesn't take much, you know? Even a tiny amount of standing water, like in a bottle cap, can be enough for mosquitoes to breed in. So, by actively getting rid of those mosquito breeding sites, you're directly cutting down the number of potential vectors in your area. That limits their chances of biting an infected animal, picking up the virus, and then carrying it to another healthy one. It really shows how interconnected these prevention strategies are, doesn't it? Tackling the insect vectors has a direct positive ripple effect on the overall health of the local wildlife.
It really is incredible, isn't it? How these seemingly small actions, like taking down a bird feeder for a while when there's an issue, or just being diligent about dumping out a puddle in the yard, can have such a significant, far-reaching effect on wildlife health, on that whole ecological balance. It definitely demonstrates the power of, informed individual action, but also maybe our inherent responsibility as people who observe and share these spaces with wildlife. ###Malzo Okay, so just to quickly recap our deep dive journey today, we started off with that initial, understandable fear and alarm, sparked by those really visually jarring images of so-called zombie animals, rabbits with horn-like things, squirrels with bald patches and awful-looking sores. But we've carefully peeled back those sensational headlines, haven't we? To understand the specific virus actually causing this lepropox virus, showing up as squirrel fibroma here in North America. And the really big takeaway, the central aha moment, I think, is that for our squirrels here, it's typically a mild condition. It's temporary. A challenging skin problem, yes, but one that most of them fully recover from. And crucially, let's just say it one more time for absolute clarity, it poses no direct threat to us humans or to our household pets, like our cats and dogs.
That's absolutely right. And it was so important to highlight those key distinctions we uncovered too. Remember, the North American squirrel fibroma, generally mild, self-limiting, but its relatives elsewhere, like the UK parapox virus or squirrel pox, that can be fatal for their red squirrels, and maybe most critically, that other virus, myxomatosis, which also causes those similar zombie-like symptoms but in rabbits and hares. That one can be incredibly virulent, often fatal, with really high mortality rates for those species. Understanding these geographical nuances is just vital if we want to avoid misunderstanding and unnecessary panic. We also really broke down those 2 main ways it spreads, didn't we? Direct contact between animal saliva, pus from lesions, especially at gathering spots, and then that very efficient indirect route using insect vectors like mosquitoes and fleas as carriers. Knowing those pathways helps us understand why we see these localized flare-ups and how the virus kind of persists in wildlife populations.
And most importantly, hopefully, we've armed you, our listener, with some simple, practical, actionable steps you can take. How to be a responsible observer, a caretaker of the wildlife sharing your space. That means, always watching wildlife from a respectful distance, resisting that urge to intervene directly with animals that look sick, even if your heart goes out to them. Avoiding contact. Maybe managing bird feeders, thoughtfully taking them down temporarily if you see infected squirrels around to stop that close contact spread. And being diligent about controlling mosquito breeding spots in your yard by getting rid of standing water. These aren't huge, difficult things. They're small, informed steps. But together, they can have a truly significant positive impact on wildlife health.
This whole deep dive, it really raises a bigger question for all of us, I think. In this age we live in, with instant information, where these really sensational headlines and visually shocking images can just spread like wildfire across our screens, How critical is it really for us to actively seek out the nuance, the scientific truth behind things that initially look terrifying? What stands out to you about the importance of that scientific understanding, that critical thinking, when we try to navigate our complex natural world? And what about our ongoing responsibility to its health, its well-being? Because that initial appearance, as we saw today, can be profoundly deceiving, can it? But having that informed knowledge, well, it empowers us with clarity and it guides us towards effective, appropriate action.
Yeah. Perhaps the real lesson here isn't ultimately about fear at all. Maybe it's more about appreciating the fascinating, often surprising resilience of nature itself, even when faced with these really visually disturbing challenges. And it's also a powerful reminder, isn't it, of our own ability, our own power to act as informed, responsible observers and caretakers, to make sure our actions actually contribute positively to the health of the ecosystems we all share. Thank you so much for joining us on this hopefully enlightening deep dive into the real truth behind the zombie squirrels.